35 through 41. This is the New Revised Standard Version. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, and just as he was in the boat, there were other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him."
The wind is a powerful force. Several years ago, when we were living in Tübingen, Germany, the whole area of South Central Europe experienced the power of the wind when a hurricane struck the coast of France. The wind began shortly after our Sunday morning worship service. Jill and I had driven a friend out to a village outside Tübingen called Emenhausen. We'd noticed the wind blowing a bit, but we didn't think anything special about it. But on the way back, we saw a large pine tree lying across the 2 lanes of traffic coming out of Tübingen that we had just driven out about 10 minutes earlier. When we got back to our apartment, we put the car in the underground garage to protect it, and we closed all the blinds in the apartment in case something should come flying through the glass. A couple of hours later, after the wind had ceased, we saw that a tree directly in front of our apartment building had been blown over. And the next day, when I went out to run my usual paths through the forest, I wasn't even able to get into the forest because there were trees just piled all across every path. In some areas, it looked like there'd been a giant going tromping through there, waving his arms and knocking down everything in his way. It took months to clear the debris in the forest and months to repair the damage to the houses in the city. Windstorms often cause fear. My mother was always afraid of windstorms. She would begin to get anxious when she would see the blackish green clouds begin to build up in the west. Now, her fears were not completely groundless because she lived in the area in the Midwest called Tornado Alley. And every year there were tornadoes that went through there, sometimes with considerable destruction. But I think that perhaps the most fearful kind of storm would be a storm at sea, when suddenly the powerful winds raise the waves so that your whole world is in motion, heaving up and down, and you go up like a mountaintop and suddenly you're plunged back down way deep into the earth. It must be fearful to be in a boat on the sea when the waves are pitching about in a high wind. But that was the situation of the disciples in the text that Troy read for us today. They'd set out in the evening to cross the Sea of Galilee. I've been to the Sea of Galilee. That sounds like a simple enough thing to do. But suddenly a windstorm descended on the sea, and the waves were so high that the boat began to fill with water. That must have been an exceptional storm because some of those men in that boat were fishermen, and they had surely been on this sea in storms before. But the description that we get of the disciples in this story is that they are immobilized by the storm. And the only thing that they are able to do is go to Jesus, who is asleep in the stern of the boat, and wake him with their cry, "Master, don't you care that we're perishing?" And then the most amazing thing happened. Jesus woke up, spoke to the wind and the sea, and they obeyed him. The wind ceased, and the sea became immediately calm. The Greek text says there was a great calm. One translation has rendered that there was a dead calm. I think that sent more chills up and down the disciples' back than the storm itself had done. To be in a boat on the sea with somebody who can speak to the wind and have it obey him. Have you ever known anyone that could stop the wind from blowing by speaking to it or doing anything else for that matter? Well, there are two sets of questions at the conclusion of this story in Mark that I want to consider with you this morning. And I start with the second one, which is the question that the disciples asked. Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? There's an interesting expression that occurs in insurance policies, insurance on property, such as houses. If your house is damaged or destroyed by wind or some other force of a storm, that's referred to as an act of God. Now, the use of that expression has both a positive and a negative side. On the negative side, that paints a rather dismal picture of God, I think. Somebody who goes around destroying people's property. But on the positive side, it's a rather correct expression, isn't it? Because only God can control the wind. The wind isn't something that's under human control. We can neither control the direction of the wind, nor command it to blow, nor command it to stop blowing. When our daughter was 2 or 3 years old, she was riding in the back seat of the car, in her car seat with her mother. And Jill had the window down in the car, and if you've ever been in the back seat of a car with the window down in the front, you know that you get a considerable amount of wind in your face. And so she said, "Mama, do you think God would stop the wind if I asked him to?" And before another word could be said, she just yelled out, "God, stop the wind!" And Jill put the window up. And that stopped the wind in the back seat of the car. But that's not quite the same thing that happened here on the Sea of Galilee. Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? The answer to the disciples' question is implied in the question itself. To whom are the wind and the sea obedient? Only to God. The Old Testament makes this very clear in a number of passages, and the disciples knew those scriptures probably in the Old Testament. The first chapter of Genesis speaks of a wind from God sweeping over the face of the waters in the creation. In the 9th chapter of Job, it speaks of God as the one who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. That's not describing, first graders who see a puddle of water and have to stomp in it. This is smoothing the sea, tramping down the waves that are rising. Or in Job chapter 26, Job says of God, by his power he stilled the sea. By his wind the heavens were made fair. And then he adds, these are indeed but the outskirts of his ways, and how small a whisper do we hear of him. But it's Psalm 89, verse 9, that comes closest to our story, when the psalmist says of God, you rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You see, control of the wind and the raging sea is clearly attributed to God in the Old Testament. But here is Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, in a boat with his disciples on the Sea of Galilee. A terrible wind arises, and the raging waves threaten to sink the boat they're in, and Jesus wakes up, rebukes the wind, tells the sea to be still, and there is a dead calm. Who then is this? The disciples asked. that even the wind and the sea obey him? The answer is implicit in the question. This man is working what Job called the outskirts of God's ways. Can there be any doubt that the question of the disciples implied the answer? God must be present in this man here in the boat with us. He didn't pray to God to stop the wind. He didn't call on God to stop the wind. He simply commanded the wind and the sea, and they obeyed him. Who could do that other than God? God was present with them in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Mark doesn't conclude the story in the gospel by saying, now you can clearly see that Jesus is the Son of God. But that's clearly the impression he intends to be made by the question he asked at the end of the story. Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Only God can control the wind. Jesus speaks to the wind, and it stops. Who then is this? No ordinary man. The other question in our story is actually two questions that follow one on the other. These are the questions Jesus asked his disciples. Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? What basis did the disciples have prior to this for faith in Jesus? Actually, they had quite a lot. Even if we look only at what Mark narrates before this story about the storm at sea. First of all, they have seen Jesus exorcise a demon in the synagogue at Capernaum. Then they've seen Jesus heal Simon Peter's mother-in-law of a fever, followed by the healing of a whole crowd of people who were either sick or demon-possessed. And then they'd seen Jesus heal a leper. And this is only in the first chapter of Mark's gospel. In chapter 2, we have the account of Jesus healing a paralyzed man who had to be carried to him. In chapter 3, he heals the man with a withered hand and an unspecified number of people who were sick or possessed with unclean spirits. The disciples had heard these unclean spirits cry out to Jesus, "You are the Son of God." In addition, the disciples have heard Jesus teaching them both in private and in public. They've heard his parables of the kingdom of God. They've heard his disputes with the Pharisees when the Pharisees claimed that he cast out demons by the power of Satan, and Jesus replied that he had to be more powerful than Satan if he was casting out demons. Jesus had privately explained his teachings to his disciples. The disciples already had quite an extensive basis for faith. But don't be too hard on the disciples, because they're exactly like you and me. First, they are ambivalent about Jesus. True, they're afraid that they're all going to perish, but they don't have the faith that they are confident that the boat in which Jesus Christ is present will not sink. And that if they are with Jesus in that boat, they will not perish. They don't yet have such a faith that they can simply have the confidence while Jesus sleeps through the storm in the stern of the boat. But on the other hand, they don't break down in utter panic and throw up their hands in despair. They go to Jesus in their crisis. Do you ever wonder, why did they wake Jesus up? Why didn't they turn to Peter or James or John or anybody else in the boat and say, "Don't you care that we're perishing? Do something." Why did they go to Jesus? Well, they knew that no one of their companions, not even Peter, could do anything about this situation, and so there was no reason to ask them to. They went to Jesus. Surely because there was some kind of faith there that he could do something. or they wouldn't have bothered to rouse him with their question. Have you never experienced ambivalence like that in your faith? You go along more or less as a Christian. You go to worship services, sometimes. You take part in Christian activities, sometimes. You pray occasionally, and then suddenly you're in a crisis. A crisis that from your standpoint could be compared to this storm on the Sea of Galilee. The wind is roaring and the waves are throwing your little boat about, and it looks for all the world like you're going under. And then you remember that the Lord is in your boat, and you cry out to Jesus. And suddenly your prayers take on a new intensity, and Jesus speaks to that situation, and there's a calm. Could he not ask you then, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? You see, the reaction of the disciples to this storm at sea is not so unusual. Unfortunately, it's rather too usual. And like them, it's difficult for us to learn that if the one who rules the raging of the sea and stills its waves is present in the little boat in which we ride, it won't sink. Psalm 107 has many similarities to the story in this text. It's a psalm about the goodness of the Lord and his repeated deliverances of his people. It speaks of the children of God in one situation after another, in which they seem to be at the end of their rope. And then the psalmist says on each occasion, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. But there's one passage in this psalm that is extremely close to this text that we are looking at. When the psalmist writes, some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the mighty waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind. Notice, God is the one who has control of the wind. He raised the stormy wind which lifted up the waves of the sea. And then the psalmist describes the sea merchants in this storm. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their calamity. They reeled and staggered like drunkards and were at their wits' end. And that was the situation of the disciples in that boat on the Sea of Galilee. It can also be our situation. Courage all gone. We don't know where to turn. We're at our wits' end. And then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, he adds, and he brought them out of their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they had quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. But then the psalmist adds the part which we often forget. After he's described the storm which changed the brave sea merchants into frightened little children at their wits' end and the gracious deliverance of the Lord when they cried to him, the psalmist adds, let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. And let us thank the Lord that he rides in this little boat we call our lives, and that he takes account of our weaknesses and saves us, notwithstanding when we cry out to him, even from an ambivalent faith.